An Odd Boy, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Part 1. September 1960 to July 1963. If you see me coming, you'd better step aside. My father, from the time I was 5, was concerned that I might be homosexual. I only came to hear of his concern in adulthood from my mother. Your father saw things in the army and he knew what could happen. I think he had bad experiences. He almost talked with me about it once, but your father was very private about such things. He said that men were prone to depravity if they were not properly supervised, disciplined, and regimented. I did try to tell him not to worry about you, but he would always say that it was his duty to be vigilant. You see, Victor, my mother sighed, he thought it might be necessary to save you from yourself. Supervised, disciplined, and regimented. Yes, that's often what life was like when my father was at home. That's why I was prone to roosting in the old yew tree in the woods. Times with my mother were always fun, so my brother Graham and I were able to have some relatively carefree periods. My father had the habit of appearing, very suddenly, round our bedroom door in the mornings. Graham and I were perplexed as to what this behaviour betokened. The door would fly open. Then his head would appear round the side of the door with a menacingly suspicious expression. Then he'd close the door slowly and without a word. Graham and I would look at each other in perplexity. Then we'd shrug our shoulders. Better not inquire. We used to enact the scene when he wasn't around. We'd roll round laughing, taking it in turns to leap into the room looking suspicious. My father's way of looking suspicious was to combine severity of expression whilst raising one eyebrow. He used more or less the same expression for the camera, and imitating him caused my brother and I great mirth. Humour was a great panacea. My father's suspicions were based on my revulsion for sport and my effeminate interests such as art and poetry. I've never been burdened with anxieties about my gender and have therefore never become homophobic. The fact that I'm male has never precluded me from anything that's taken my interest. My father always had his beady eye on me and was often irate about something that seemed entirely irrelevant to me. I blew all through the window, blown all misty speed, and came upon an ogre, very loud indeed. A fragment of poetry written by the author, aged 7. The window was, in fact, the French windows that opened out of our dining room onto the garden. I'd sometimes enter by those glass doors, only to find my father in a fury about someone or something somewhere which didn't meet with his approval. Surprisingly, it wasn't always me. The strangest aspect to my father's suspicions with regard to my sexual orientation was based on the fact that I preferred the company of girls. I always have done. I hadn't forgotten Alice, and I was certain she'd not forgotten me. Hereford couldn't be much bigger than Farnham, and so one day I'd just go there and find her. I regarded boys as being made of slugs and snails and puppy dog tails. Somehow I excluded myself from this category, but the reasons are opaque. I tended to be an exception to any rule I didn't particularly like. My father, however, thought a single-sex junior school would straighten me out or something. Infant school had been gloriously free of team sport, but junior school was a nightmare of ball games. The balls of Moloch were horribly in evidence, as were boys, and I eyed them warily. They seemed infantile and ridiculous, ready to fight for reasons I couldn't comprehend. I'd been hit repeatedly and pushed about the schoolyard by a particular boy called Adrian Parrott. He appeared to pick on me without cause, and evidently thought it fun to make my play periods miserable. One day I decided that enough was enough, and knocked him to the floor with a blow to the nose. I didn't intend to hit him on the nose. I just swung out at him, and his nose was at the end of the swing. There was more blood than I imagined was possible. His white shirt was sodden with it. The poor boy was terrified. So was I. I thought he was going to die. Trouble erupted over my premiere as a pugilist. Other boys, onlookers, came to my defence. I'd been hit first, but the teachers seemed to think that I had hit back far too hard. I probably did hit him too hard, but I'd never hit anyone before. How was I supposed to know what would happen? The teachers eyed me as some sort of thug. I'd obviously been slugging it out since I was a toddler. This was hardly my image of myself. This was the first time I'd fought, so I was confused by the way in which I was treated. I had no idea that I could cause such injury. I said that I'd had no intention of hurting Adrian as much as I had done, but they didn't believe me. I was sent home at the end of the day with a severely worded letter to my parents. For once, however, my father seemed pleased with me. He wrote back to the school telling them that I was not, and had never been, the type of boy to fight. I was not to be punished for defending myself against bullies, especially as there were witnesses to the effect that I had not started the fight. He said that it was their job to police the playground and to prevent bullying. If they were not capable of maintaining discipline and good behaviour, then they had no business running a school. He told them it was right and proper that I defend myself against attack, and that he stood behind me in defending myself on any future occasion it proved necessary. He read the letter to me, beaming. I was stunned by his response. I'd expected him to punish me. The last severely worded letter he'd written, to the parents of Alice Trevelyan, had caused me great misery, so I wondered what was going to happen next. Nothing happened. I was deeply sorry for Adrian Parrott, but the outcome proved useful. I was never bullied again at that school. It wasn't over a week, in fact, before I was talking to Adrian in a friendly way. The teachers noticed that I never fought anyone else, and my form teacher took me aside to tell me that they were happy with my behaviour in the playground. Everything was forgotten, and the teachers accepted that I was not a homicidal hoodlum. I made friends with a boy called Steve Bruce after my first and last pugilistic enterprise. He'd seen the punch that knocked Adrian to the ground and was severely impressed. I've always been quite strong, but not due to any intention of becoming so. I was happy to be physically capable as a child. I enjoyed running down rocky hillsides in a style that now reminds me of the parallel turns in skiing. I enjoyed diving and swimming underwater, and, of course, climbing trees. I told Steve about what I liked to do, but fighting was not on the list. He wondered why. "You're so obviously good at it." "I just want to be friends with people," I said, and added, "and I like blues more than anything." He'd not heard of that. I sang him a few lines. He thought it was amazing that I sang, and in such a way. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "From Mr. Love. He lives down our road and knows everything about blues. He's got a huge collection of blues records. They're fantastic, and he knows a lot about the lives of the blues musicians. My father hates it, though." Steve thought that was a pity. "My father would think it was great." A father who liked blues? Who'd ever heard of such a thing? Then Steve told me that he had a guitar and had guitar lessons. I looked at him as if he was royalty. I told him, "Fighting is extremely stupid. I'm far more interested in guitars than whacking someone on the nose and making them bleed all over the place." Steve thought about it and agreed. "Yes, I'd rather have a guitar than fight too." We were good friends from that day on. My father seemed pleased that I had a male friend, and especially one whose father was a police superintendent. I was simply glad I had a friend. I still missed Alice. I didn't mention Alice to Steve because I didn't know what to say. It seemed like a subject that needed to be private. Steve was interested in wildlife. He had a collection of animal and nature magazines that he organised in dedicated folders. I thought that was marvellous. I'd never seen specialist magazines before. Steve was a serious-minded boy, quite different from the majority of sport-obsessed poltroons. I liked him immediately. He was almost a year and a half older than me. His birthday was in September, and mine was in June. He'd been held back a school year due to some severe childhood illness that interrupted his schooling for 9 months. He was far more intelligent than I was, but I wasn't so dull-witted that the fact wasn't obvious to me. He didn't make a show of it, though, and seemed to appreciate my unusual perspectives. Where I lacked knowledge of anything, he was always helpful, never condescending. He lacked most characteristics I disliked in boys. To begin with, he was not an idiot. Most boys were idiots as far as I could see. They delighted in urinating over the top of the wall of the urinal when someone was drinking from the drinking fountain on the other side. I won't go into detail concerning the manner in which this feat was accomplished, but suffice it to say that Steve and I found it puerile. We'd stand guard for each other and never suffered the indignity of a malodorous drenching. Steve's childhood illness had given him a taste for reading and a sense of maturity that I found refreshing. He was far more pragmatic than I found myself to be. He approached projects methodically and carried ideas through with impressive perseverance. This was what was needed when it came to painting, poetry and music. That much became apparent to me without a word being spoken. Steve was not personally interested in developing poetry or painting because he wanted to concentrate on music. It seemed sensible to focus attention, but I had no guitar, and so music would remain one of a group of interests until times changed. Although Steve wasn't interested in writing, he was an avid reader. He was reading Guy de Maupassant and all kinds of alarmingly advanced material at the age of 10. I was mightily impressed. He made me feel that I had a duty to myself to be well read and to know about literature, and that spurred me on in reading. The other boys read cartoon material for boys, usually on the theme of war. They depicted rather ugly men with unsightly square jaws. I told Steve, I hope becoming an adult won't do that to my jaw. That made him laugh. No, Vic, jaws don't change shape like that. I've never seen anyone with a jaw like that, anyway.